took us through a deep of the learning and integration portion of ADLI, the ADLI framework. During this week's discussion, we are lucky to have Anthony Napalotino with us. Anthony is a seasoned project manager, Scrum Master. He's an agilist and a product owner in the financial industry. He'll be with us to cover Let's See. Let's See stands for Levels, Trends, Comparisons, and Integration, just as a reminder. It's otherwise known as the results portion of our framework. It's an important part of the framework because it provides a method for determining whether the ADLI framework that we put in place is working as intended. Let's See also helps us to zero in on those areas that we might need to make an adjustment in. Those adjustments are important in order for us to improve our organizational performance. Just like previous sessions, after Anthony finishes his presentation, I'll go ahead and provide a summary of the key points that he's covered, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Just as a reminder, questions can be submitted through the chat channel. So at this point, Anthony, if you're ready to go, I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to learning a little bit more about Let's See.
All right, thank you. Let's go ahead and get going. You know, our title is here is measuring what matters most. But what I like to call it is, no, really, how are you doing? Because that's what we're getting to. How are you doing really? Like, you know, if your doctor asks you how you're doing, you say, you know, like we say as a courtesy, oh, I'm doing fine. No, your doctor wants to know, you know, what's your blood pressure? What's your temperature? What's your vital statistics? And go through and find out, like, how are you really doing? And that's what Let's See helps you do, is how are you really doing as we go through it. So let's, you know, start again. Let's see. We talked about it before. This is Roland's slide. He introduced it to us, and I just kept it because it's still good. You know, when we look at the performance assessment, when we look at Let's See, we look at levels, trends, comparisons, and integrations. And this is what it is. Like, really, what are your current performance levels? Are the scales appropriate to measure what your levels are? What's your performance over time for your trends? You know, are they favorable or unfavorable? Are they, you know, how does it work? How does it look? You know, your comparisons. Well, how do you do in relation to other people and other organizations? You know, how in your industry as a whole as we go through it. And lastly, integration. And, you know, that is like, how important is this measure? Honestly, how many of us, you know, think about this for a second? How many people measure things that really just aren't that important, but either it has a measurement inertia, as in we've been measuring for a while, it has political connections, people want to see this, or, you know, has other kinds of details. It's like, we measured this. Does it really matter? And, you know, that's your integration. What's important? What is also, does it, you know, go to? What can you look at the same time to get a more whole picture? And also, like, you know, how can we dig deeper and look at, you know, our segments of what's going on there? So that's where we'll go through. That's kind of a survey of where we go through. Now we're going to start going, you know, down the rabbit hole, as I like to say here. You know, I'm the white rabbit. You know, just follow along as we go. And it's not, don't worry, it's not going to be trippy or confusing. It is really just looking at numbers. I also like to say, like, Let's See is not about you know, advanced mathematics. Let's See is about communicating about numbers, specifically metrics and results. So let's start with levels. Levels is kind of where you set the stage. You know, if we use this, you know, a story analogy for it, you know, or more importantly, like theater. Like, let's set the stage. What's your background? How do you tell where's the foreground, where's the background, what's important? You know, and how do you measure things up? You know, it shows your performance against a meaningful scale. Really, that's what it's all about, you know, making sure your performance is put in context correctly. It also reflects the way you measure and the maturity of your measures. It shows up in levels. Maturity is going to be shown by how you measure and how do you normalize the data. And we'll get into normalization in a second. But also, you know, how mature is your measure? Is, you know, maturing your measure is a low-hanging fruit. It's an easy thing to, you know, get better at, you know, looking at your data and maturing the way you measure. But it's not always picked. People, you know, kind of get used to measuring a certain way, and they don't realize there's more depth into it. You know, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about levels. Let's talk maturity for a second, and we'll get into an example. For maturity, you know, it's kind of like, counts. People are used to counts. And Roland did a very good job. He didn't just give us a raw count in that, earlier slide. He gave us, well, in his slides when he did them last time, he showed us like, turnover. So he's looking at seat turnover. So he normalized the data. He took that data and said, like, let's just count how many times, how many covers we served, how many meals we served to people in this restaurant. He said, how many meals per seat? So that way he knows, what is his capacity also when we look at things. Let's take a look here. Turnover rate, customer serve per 1 hour time period will give you also a good piece. That's another great. So customers per hour. And you can go customers per seat per hour and go even deeper. And that's where you have to watch it, because you have to figure, where's the meaningful level? Am I above it or below it in the way I am measuring this, well, in my levels and scales? You also need to, where do I need to go with this? Sometimes you'll normalize in a way to help your segmentations, covers per seat per hour. And then, maybe you're going to segment by server. Maybe you're going to segment by location. Any kind of work unit you have to break down. That's how you get more mature, is you find that normalization level that helps you out best. For maturity, also sometimes, we deal a lot with Likert responses for surveys. And there, a lot of people like, well, hey, if I just told you 80 people gave me a 4 out of 5, what does that tell you? All that tells you is that 80 people gave me a 4 out of 5. Now, if I told you my average response was a 4 out of 5, that just tells you that, more than half, that half the people liked it 4 or better. It doesn't tell you anything about those other half the people. What it means. That means, I had people giving me less than a 4 for the rest of the time. If I told you, though, 80% of the respondents gave me a 4 out of 5, that tells you you're doing pretty good. If you start looking at other restaurants, you can see a lot better of that. Look at them, only 50% give them a 4 out of 5. That tells you quite a bit. It helps with the maturity of your measure by going beyond, just giving raw data and counts. We spent a lot of time talking about this in Sterling. What's the best way to get your data? How do you make sure you put that scale meaningfully? And that last one, that most mature, your percentage of a standard. We love doing that. That's a Six Sigma piece we bring in, and it's one that's easy to adopt, especially when you start having responses. So let's get into an example here. So let's start with that first one. Like, look on the left, you see the turnover rate. Okay, covers per hour, 43. Okay, great. 43. That tells you that, hey, you can tell you how much money you're making. If you know the average cost of your dish, you can be able to determine that. You can take a look at your expenses, how much it costs to serve those people, and by hour, what your hourly expenses is. You can built in a fixed rate for that also, and you can get an idea of how well you're doing with 43. But maybe you also need to look at covers per seat. So, okay, I've got 4.3 covers per seat. That's pretty good. You're turning pretty quickly. I'm hoping you're a fast service restaurant at 4.3 covers per seat, because that tells me that, you have 4.3 people per hour is sitting in a seat at a time, so they're not taking more, they're going to take less than 15 minutes to eat their meal. But maybe you also need to look at servers. Instead, you're going to slice it by servers, covers per server per hour. And that's good to also see, you know how efficient your servers are, what their capacity is to handle it. And also, the servers know if they're working on a tip scale, that 21.5 an hour lets them know that, hey, they get quite a few customers to get tips from. If you're a fast service restaurant, it's lower margins, it's smaller, tips, but they need more customers to go through them. So this is what we mean as we go through. What's a turnover rate, how you can normalize it, how you can look deeper into the numbers. So now we're going to move on to trends. There we go. So trends, as I like to call it, the backstory. Like, how do we get here to where you are? And it really provides a historical view on how you're doing. The big question we always have with trends is, how far back do you go? And if you look at it as a story, it helps you there, because, like, well, where's the story start? Does the story start, a year ago? Does it start 5 years ago? That's how you have to look at it. If it's been steadily building over 10 years, you want to tell all 10 years so you can show that whole 10 years. But if you like, if you plateaued like 10 years ago and 5 years ago you finally said, hey, that's enough, we need to see how we can be better, and you made a change, maybe that's where you want to start your story and look back and only go back those 5 years. Um, and if the change happened this year, maybe go back, to the last change before that. So that way you have a good idea of like how you got to where you were and why you made a change. Um, Another question you have to ask your trends is how frequently do you measure, also known as the cycle time. So, and my, tip to you is it's as often as important to the changes. Both your known changes, your unknown changes. So, as you look at your data, like where do you see changes in your data? Like, the pieces going. Maybe it was due to something you did. Maybe it was due to something that's outside your control. A good way to look at that, we're 5 years, 4 years removed from COVID, started 5 years ago. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, during COVID are all three different timescales. And, where does your story really start? Does it start pre-COVID? Does it start during COVID? Does it start after COVID? And that's how you choose that time measure of going. And also how when you go through cycles, it's like, hey, is your business seasonal? Should I worry about what's in coming in summer if I get I'm pretty much closed down, I flex my workers somewhere else, and they're not serving people versus and maybe you deal to a lot of sunbirds. We're in the state of Florida. I am Tampa, beautiful sunny Tampa. You go to the beaches by me, and definitely, like right now, it's not high season. There's not as many restaurants open. There's not as many hours going. Some people are, not as many people going in. And some workers travel to somewhere else during the summer to make more money and take it off. Some people don't. Some places, I'm from New England, we had our high time in the summer. And believe me, people came all over. College students especially love to come to work the summer beach season in New England. And work the restaurants, serving the lobsters, getting out to people. So you have to look at that also. Like, when's your seasonality of your business? Maybe it's you're working on something for the last 2 years and you want to show quarterly. That's how I work. I worked as a project manager for many years now as a product owner. Usually have a 2 to 5 year horizon. But my company, we like to look at things quarterly. What's going on within your quarter, and how we're able to work with in that quarter. So that's where we work. And generally, a year is good for the most general cases, but you have to look deeper and say, is a good year good enough for you? Does it really show your story as we go through? So here we go with trends, starting to look at it. Here's a good story, and I built, a restaurant for our examples here. So, good is up. And as we go through, you can see, hey, we were doing quite well pre-COVID in our covers per hour, but all of a sudden, we get hit by COVID. People are going out to eat so much, maybe maybe the local government made me close down my restaurant. Maybe people didn't come at all. Maybe I was still able to do some work by takeout, but it just wasn't the same. And then all of a sudden we opened back up, and look at that. We popped back in. And you can see in the story, you can see what the backstory is from this. You can see, hey, here we go. Pre-COVID, it's doing great. Post-COVID, everyone, post-COVID, all of a sudden everybody wanted to take vacation. They were sick of seeing their four walls. They were coming to my restaurant. They were coming out to eat. They were, sick of eating at home. They had a little money saved up. They were happy to come out. But you know what? They regressed in 2023. They're like, hey, the enthusiasm wasn't there anymore. That doesn't mean we did anything bad. We just rode a seasonality of things through. And then, hey, look at that. We're doing well again. So, our overall trend is quite good. But more importantly, the story here tells you everything. It says, we had a bad year, maybe an enthusiasm gap, but overall, it's a good trend, and that's where you can tell your story. Same for your turnover rates. Look at your turnovers over, over the years. You can see now, like, when's my low season? May, June, July. May starts going down. June, July, August. Maybe July, 4th of July, people come out to your restaurant. Maybe say in September they start coming back a little bit for for Labor Day, but October we start going back up. And maybe people don't come to my restaurant in November because they want to eat at home for Thanksgiving, or they're visiting family, doing the things that goes. So, all these things you can see as you look at your piece, you ask those questions to figure out the true meaning. I'm just giving you guys examples. There may be other stories in there, when you look at your own seasonality to see what's going on. or maybe you don't have it. Maybe you have constant churn and constant burn, which is great. So after, next in Let's See is we go to comparisons. I call them the other characters. Because really it is like, how does your character, how does that main character, deal with other characters? How well are they going? And it shows some contrast to provide meaning. We go back to Shakespeare. We look at, Romeo versus Mercutio versus Tybalt. Three different characters, but their actions with the others show you depth of character between the three of them. You can compare and contrast. Targets are great for comparisons. What are your internal targets? What are your goals? And that shows your vision with comparisons. Peers are great, because sometimes you're not competing them, but they're a peer organization. They're like you, they're doing the same kind of work, but you're not in direct competition. And it can show you where you stand in the pack. Hey, look how I'm doing compared to my peers. Organizations doing the same thing in a different environment. Maybe you're a chain of restaurants. How does my location in Tampa differ from my location in Jacksonville or Orlando or Miami? Maybe they shouldn't be compared because Miami's on the beach,
Olo
Tampa
Yukasa.
downtown, and we go through like that. Competitors are great because if you're in a competitive environment, you need to look at how you're doing with versus other people, and you have to figure out what kind of competitor are there. Are they direct competitor? Are you guys going after the same customers, or you just happen to be doing the same thing in the same market and you have different customer bases? But it's good to take a look there. Are they taking your customers, or are you taking their customers? Are you leading them if you're going up against direct competition? Or do you need to get better? Are they doing something that you need to adopt, or do you need to innovate to do better than they are? And industry measures and benchmarks are really amazing if you can find them. They're not always available for you, and they don't always work because, again, when you look at certain things, it just makes it so that it doesn't, you can't always compare apples to apples. But for a lot of things we can, and it's good. And the exercise of going out and finding these comparisons is just as good as having the comparisons themselves, because it makes you take a closer look at what you're doing and what other people are doing. And you need to decide who you want to be measured against. Do you want to be measured? Do you want to be average? If you want to be average, hey, if you're the worst, average is a great place to look up to. But do you want to remain average once you get there, or do you want to keep going? Do you want to be top decile? That's a great place to be. Top 90%, top 10% of your group. You're better than 90% of other people out there. It's a great place. But or do you want to be the best? That's not always feasible. It's not always worth your money. But hey, it's a great thing to go. I mean, that's kind of how we're built. We want to be the best. You got to figure out if it's worth your time though, or is it top decile good enough as you go through. And that's how we go. Another thing, back to our stories, I like to always say is you need a good villain to know how good your hero is, or sometimes how not so good your hero is when we take it frankly, as we look at things. So some examples with comparisons here. I've got some comparisons in, taking Roland's restaurant as we go through, looking at that turnover rate as it's going up, and and then we look at the industry average. So you can see here, looking just at an industry average, Roland started out in 2020, behind, but moved up, got better. His processes got better, and look, he's been exceeding the industry average for the last 3 years. Great, good job. But you know what? Roland wants to be the best, so he's not going to just look at the industry average. And if you look at the right side, look, we're going to look at top decile, and Roland's got great, ambitions. He wants to be, maybe not the best, but he wants to be among the best and talked about like he's the best. So what does he do? He starts off, he knows he's below industry average and way below the top decile. So he sets himself that target. First, I'm going to beat the average, then I'm going to beat the top decile. And that way you can keep working and know what you're working forwards to where, here, we got that hero story. Look at him right here. He's in the top decile. Maybe he is the best at this point. And, it's just not shown in the graph. As we go through. So another thing great to look at here is, I like to give 2 marks when appropriate. For this one, it was very appropriate to have both the average and the top decile so we can see where you fit. I call that bracketing. So you're going to bracket yourself between the two measures that are important to you, that average and that top decile. So that way, okay, as we're hitting the average, that's a good place to go. But now it gives me a lot of meaning because I can tell, hey, like starting here, I'm between the average and the top decile. So I'm growing well, and I can make a little bit better interpretation of how good I'm doing. If I just have the average there, I know I'm doing better, but I have no idea how I'm doing, in that top group. And if I just have, the top decile, well, I know, while I'm below there, that top decile trend, I don't know how close I am. By giving you those both, it gives you a way to interpolate what's in between and where you stand. And also what we can do to make this even better is have that closest peer in there. Have that piece where we're going like, hey, here's my closest peer, here's where we're going, and or better yet, here's my competitor, where does my competitor stand? Maybe your competitor is the best in the industry, and then you have to realize, like, do I really need to beat my competitor, or do I just have to be, is my market segment, is my market slice good enough that I can be, neck and neck with my competitor and still be profitable and still make my goals? Once you start looking at these, that's where you can start making those decisions and start really determining how are you really doing. So lastly, we go to integration. Integration is the hardest one for most people because it's a little bit more like, what do I do with integration? Well, what else does it mean? Um, and those are things I can't tell you. I can't tell you why that measure is so important unless I know your measure and you tell me. Like, Roland has to tell me what, I'm gonna have to ask him, Roland, why is it so important that you're looking at, covers per hour? And he's gonna tell me, listen, Anthony, I'm a fast service restaurant. I need to be able to, what's it called? Burn and turn. I gotta put food, put it out there, have them eating, and get that seat free for the next person. That's how my industry works. That's why it's important. You need to know what processes and measures tie to that result and can give deeper meaning when you look at them together. Not only do I want to look at, how fast that turnover is, but I want to look at satisfaction because I'll be able to tell me if people are going to keep coming back and I'm going to keep having the crowds I need for that to sustain that turnover. That's what I call a correlated measure. Well, what measures go together? And also, sometimes it's leading and lagging. Anthony, my turnover is something I can measure every day that'll help me point towards what my profitability is. And this is how much money I'm going to make, and I know what I need to turn to have, profit and what I need to do to be successful. Also important is like who looks at the measure because that'll tell you, what you need to tailor that measure for. If your servers are looking for it, you want to make sure you normalize per server and you want to segment per server. So that way they can see how well they're doing versus everyone else. Um, you know, and there we go. What else do you want? How do you segment? That leads us right there. You want to look at your different locations. Maybe you want to look at your different areas. Again, if you have a restaurant, if Roland's got a restaurant in Tampa, Miami, he's got one in Orlando and Jacksonville, he wants to look at each one separately to see how they're doing individually. You want to look at different customer groups. Maybe his Miami group is more fine dining. They want to stick around for 2 hours with their meal and have a business meeting. Where their location in Jacksonville is pure burn and turn, and they want to just come in, get their food, and get out. So you have to look at the different customer groups, different work units. Maybe you have that restaurant has different areas. Maybe you have, your regular dining room, and maybe you have a VIP area where people do business conferences and business lunches, and they're going to sit in there for 2 hours. So it's important to take a look at it that way too. So I got multiple examples here when it comes to, segmenting. So, here we go. This is it. Like, let's segment by server. So I've got, Alice, Bob, Carol, and Dan as we go through, and we can see how they do covers per hour. And here we go. We know Alice is, when it comes to turnover, Alice is the queen. She is the top of the pack. She's doing the best. Bob's right there with him. Carol and Dan are a little bit farther behind. That doesn't, there could be other things in there. Maybe that Carol and Dan work the night shift where they stay longer. Maybe an Alice and Bob are on lunch where, they get in, get their lunch, and get out. So you need to take a look at how they're working there. So there are always other questions to ask, but it's always good to look at it because at least if these two are on the same shift, does Alice have a better section, or is Alice better? And maybe she could teach Bob, and maybe they're all four on the same places, and maybe you pair Alice, Bob with Carol and Dan so that they can learn how to more efficiently work their tables. Maybe you want to look at your sections because again, you have a main dining room, you have your cafe, you have your VIP, and maybe you have a chef's table in the kitchen where they're doing a 20 course tasting, and you only have 2 seats. So if somebody or 4 seats, and somebody's in there for 2 hours, that's 2 people per hour. As you go through and taking a look at it, like, hey, there we go. Like how do we look at this? How do we get this going on? So now you know how long it takes, and say, do you know what? I'm not going to look at the turn on the chef's table. Do you know what? That's as long as I'm filling it each night, that's all that matters to me. VIP, I'm going to make sure that it's at a level that it's worth keeping my VIP room open. But you're made in your cafe, and you say, hey, I got more seats in my cafe. Maybe I need to, do something to get people in there. Or maybe you say, hey, my main dining room's at capacity and people are waiting, and I need to find a way to, shift them to the cafe where I have open seats. So just by segmenting, you can ask these deeper questions about your processes and get to the next level. And and again, how are you really doing? And now I'm going to give we're going to look at the correlated measures. Like how are we doing, bit by bit? Turnover rate, again, I'm still going here at like, covers per hour, but let's take a look at satisfaction. So now I can know that, Alice, yeah, she's got a great turn rate, but her customers aren't satisfied. Maybe she's not taking enough time with them. Maybe she needs to slow down a little bit so that she can keep that satisfaction and they'll keep coming back. Where Bob, he's got a pretty good, he's not the top, but he's got a great turnover rate, and he's got a great satisfaction. So they go together, and you can get looking at where we need to go. Carol's next. Carol doesn't have great satisfaction, and she doesn't turn. Maybe she's just not that good. Maybe you need to have a discussion of, is she brand new and she doesn't know what she's doing? Or is she been here a while and she's put on the job and she's just here to make a paycheck, and maybe you could find somebody better. And then looking at Dan. Dan's got amazing satisfaction, but his turnover rate isn't there. So you got to ask yourself, maybe Dan has more high-priced customers that stay longer, and maybe he's, it's better that he's doing that and getting that 5 stars and getting them there every day, and maybe they're always regulars, and maybe it's good that Dan has a low turnover rate because he's dealing with the customers that want to be there and want to spend time, and you have to figure that out. Again, this just leads you to better questions and better looking at what you're doing and leads you back to your processes. So that leads us to our wrap up. So, the things I always have to ask are, are your measures effective at evaluating an organization, its processes, and its work systems? What can you do to improve your measures from what you know about Let's See Now? So, always ask yourself these things, and that'll help you to measure better and have better processes.
Great job, Anthony. Thank you so much. Really love the comparison charts you presented. It's one thing to have levels and trends, but when you throw those levels and trends up against the comparison, you can really tell how well you're doing from an industry perspective. So what I'm going to do is I did capture notes. I'll read through those. I see that we only have 2 minutes left. I'll read through these. We do have one question we can cover. We have a couple more, but we'll cover the one, and then we'll wrap it up, hopefully pretty close to time, maybe a minute or two over. Let's see. Let's see tells you how you're really doing. I love that question. It stands for levels, trends, comparisons, and integration. Levels pertains to a chosen scale that is used to identify and define your current performance level. Trends are created based upon your levels over time, and it's used to determine if you are performing favorably or unfavorably. Trends are a historical view. Comparisons are used to identify performance in comparison to, it could be either competitors or peers. This is necessary to identify best-in-class benchmarks. Integration relates performance to strategic priorities and other key concern areas of the organization in order to identify how that performance is helping the organization. Then we switch to a key topic of maturity. Maturity leverages data normalization to provide a view of levels and trends that provides an understanding of potential that is not utilized and/or to ensure that we are comparing apples to apples. Comparisons are essential for maturity because they determine the meaningfulness of the work that is completed beyond just looking at averages. Comparisons are best aligned to strategic objectives and company vision. Comparisons can provide insights for customers and consumers that may not be visible without a comparison. Integration provides insight into the deeper meaning of why we are performing certain activities. Integration leverages segmentation, and I appreciate the fact that you went over segmentation to provide a more meaningful view of the measures we're achieving. And then segmentation is a view at different locations, different teams, customer groups, or employee groups. And then lastly, you covered up with, you covered the topic of, let's see, with correlated measures. Correlated measures can be used to track or trend individual performance in comparative mode. So hopefully I got everything, Anthony. Question for you. What would you recommend for our listeners today as to the first step that they can take when they want to construct a let's see framework or a let's see model? What would you recommend?
First, you have to understand, your measure. And to understand your measure, you need to understand your process. So once you understand what your process is, you have to determine what's the best way to measure it, because that will give you your setting, that'll give you your scale. Your trends will come along with it. So the first step, though, is set your measure and understand your measure and understand if its effectiveness versus your process. Everything else has to build off of that. I'm going to give you a second step too. Second step is to look for competitors. Look for comparisons if possible. Trends just come with time. After that, you can, after you've built up some data, then you can worry about segmentations and correlated measures. But first, understand your process and understand how your measure ties to your process.
Okay, and then understanding the process also includes understanding the tie of your levels into your strategic objectives, priorities, and perhaps your company's mission and vision.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you everyone for joining us for episode 4 of our summer learning series. Next week, Bob Medeiros will be the host, and we will have a great topic on organizational maturity, a little bit more of a deep dive into scoring techniques for your framework. So make sure to join us next week. Thank you all for attending. And thank you, Anthony. Appreciate it.